How a UN weapon inspector attempted to stop the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 and why he was unsuccessful. By Scott Ritter, a former U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer, INF treaty inspector, member of General Schwarzkopf's staff during the Gulf War, and UN weapons inspector from 1991 to 1998.
Note, this article details how a UN weapons inspector was powerless to halt the world's most powerful war machine, fed by its president's lies. The fact that no one can prove a negative is a fundamental logical truth we must be aware of. Despite their best efforts, UN weapons inspectors could not conclusively demonstrate that Iraq has destroyed its WMD. Ultimately, it's a trap to demand that Iraq disarm.
On January 28, 2003, the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush, addressed the American people in front of the rostrum in the United States Congress chambers, carrying out his solemn, legally mandated duty. The President opened by saying, "Mr. Speaker, Vice President Cheney, members of Congress, distinguished people, and fellow citizens, by law and custom, we gather here every year to discuss the status of the Union. This year, we gather in this chamber deeply aware of the decisive days that lie ahead," he said solemnly. The decisive days Bush referred to have to do with the choice he had previously made to invade Iraq against international law to overthrow Saddam Hussein as the country's leader. Since Bush 41, George H.W. Bush, the father of Bush 43, compared Saddam Hussein to Adolf Hitler and demanded Nuremberg-style justice for the crime of invading Kuwait, regime change has been the cornerstone of American strategy towards Iraq. At a Republican fundraiser in Dallas, Texas, the elder Bush addressed the crowd, calling it Hitler revisited. But remember, the Nuremberg trials were held after Hitler's war. Presidents who want to lead their nation into war, in particular, cannot ignore such pronouncements by American lawmakers. As a result, even after driving the Iraqi army from Kuwait in February 1991, Saddam Hussein had to go because he was the Middle East's equivalent of Adolf Hitler. The sanctions imposed on Iraq by the Bush 41 administration were supported by the UN and were intended to choke off the country's economy and encourage internal regime change. These penalties were related to Iraq's commitment to give up its long-range missiles, chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons programs, and other capacities for using weapons of mass devastation. The sanctions continued until UN weapons inspectors declared Iraq to be disarmed. But until Saddam Hussein is overthrown, as Bush's Secretary of State James Baker made clear, these sanctions won't be eased. As long as Saddam Hussein is in power, Baker declared on May 20, 1991, we are not interested in seeing a relaxation of sanctions. Saddam Hussein outlived the Bush 41 presidency despite the sanctions. Bill Clinton, who succeeded Bush in office, kept up the sanctions strategy and combined it with UN weapons inspections to bring down Saddam Hussein. To overthrow Saddam in June 1996, the Clinton administration pretended to be conducting UN weapons inspections. The strategy didn't work, but the policy did. The Iraqi Liberation Act, which Clinton signed in 1998, established regime change in Iraq as official U.S. policy. Saddam survived longer than the Clinton presidency as well. However, when it came to carrying out U.S. intentions to overthrow the government in Iraq, the third time proved to be the charm. After Bush 41's son, George W. Bush, was elected president in 2001, Saddam's fate was set. Even though Clinton was unable to overthrow Saddam Hussein, he was successful in putting an end to UN efforts to monitor Iraq's disarmament. This allowed the U.S. to maintain that Iraq was not abiding by its responsibility to disarm and support the prolongation of economic sanctions. The situation now turns personal. The author worked as one of Iraq's top UN weapons inspectors from 1991 to 1998, supervising Iraq's disarmament. The CIA attempted to utilize my inspection team in June 1996 to aid in the initiation of a coup against Saddam, and the United States' ongoing meddling in the work of his inspection teams led to his resignation from the UN in August 1998. A few months after he left, the Clinton administration forced the UN weapons inspectors to leave Iraq before beginning Operation Desert Fox, a bombing campaign. During Operation Desert Fox, most of the sites bombed had nothing to do with the production of weaponry. During the 72-hour campaign, 97 strategic targets were hit, of which 86 were explicitly tied to Saddam Hussein's security, including palaces, military barracks, security stations, intelligence schools, and headquarters. All of these locations had been submitted to UNSCOM inspections, the majority of which he had conducted, and their operations were well known and confirmed as unrelated to UNSCOM. Everyone familiar with these locations understood the mission of Operation Desert Fox. Saddam Hussein, not Iraq's WMDs, was the objective. Following these airstrikes, Iraq permanently expelled the UN inspectors. A fact, the US has always had this as its primary objective. With a new government in place, the US was attempting to utilize the ambiguity regarding the state of Iraq's WMD programs as leverage with the American people and the rest of the world to support an attack on Iraq to remove Saddam Hussein from office permanently. By the fall of 2002, it was evident that our country was on the verge of war. Ritter chose to stop it because he took it personally. He went to Congress and tried to get the Senate Foreign Relations and Intelligence Committees to hold open hearings on Iraq. They declined. The only option to stop the invasion was to allow the inspectors back into the nation to show that it wasn't a threat severe enough to warrant war, but the Iraqis were putting up so many obstacles that it would not happen. Therefore, he decided to get involved as a regular person. Met with former Foreign Minister and counselor to Saddam Hussein Tariq Aziz in South Africa and urged him to address the Iraqi National Assembly publicly without having his remarks altered or verified. The inspectors could only be allowed back in that way. Aziz initially said he was insane. After deliberating for 2 days, Aziz decided. In his address to the Iraqi National Assembly, Ritter. People have accused him of treason for that reason alone, even though he gave the Iraqis no leeway in that address and held them responsible for the crimes they had perpetrated. He cautioned them that the inspectors had to be allowed back in since they were about to be invaded. The Iraqi government had to deal with me after I made that public. Ritter spoke with the president's science advisor, vice president, foreign minister, and oil minister. 5 days later, they persuaded Saddam Hussein to grant unconditional access to weapons inspectors in Iraq. Sadly, it was not meant to be. UN inspectors did indeed return, but the US constantly worked to discredit their findings and sabotage their work. Finally, on that fateful evening of January 28, 2003, the president stood up to finish the mission, to present evidence supporting the war because Iraq posed a threat due to its unreported WMD. This argument was not brand new. Ritter has attempted to disprove this line of reasoning since the US forced the UN weapons inspectors out of Iraq in December 1998. He published a lengthy piece in Arms Control Today in June 2000. He delivered copies of it to every member of Congress at the request of Senator John Kerry, a critical member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee from Massachusetts. In addition, he attempted to inform the American public about the reality of Iraqi WMD, the state of their disarmament, and the insufficiency of the U.S. cause for war in his 2001 documentary film In Shifting Sands. However, the President of the United States presented a case for war based on fabrications, abusing his constitutional duty to notify Congress. Bush stated that nearly 3 months ago, the UN Security Council gave Saddam Hussein his last opportunity to disarm. Note, this was after Ritter assisted in persuading Iraq to permit UN weapons inspectors to return without conditions. Instead, he has demonstrated total contempt for the UN and the international community's consensus. For example, when pointing out that Iraq had refused to cooperate with UN weapons inspectors, Bush said, "It was up to Iraq to show exactly where it is hiding its banned weapons, lay those weapons out for the world to see, and destroy them as commanded." Nothing comparable has ever occurred. Iraq had declared that it no longer had any WMD and was therefore unable to provide the whereabouts of any hidden non-existent weapons. In actuality, the UN weapons inspectors had refuted the intelligence the US had provided, alleging Iraqi non-compliance while working in complete coordination with the Iraqi government. When James Baker stated in May 1991 that sanctions would not be withdrawn until Saddam Hussein was ousted from power, the US was functioning under those principles. The president continued by asserting missing biological agents such as anthrax and botulinum toxin. Similar assertions were made regarding the chemical weapons sarin, mustard, and VX. The president said, The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed in the 1990s that Saddam Hussein had a sophisticated nuclear weapons development program, had a nuclear weapon design and was working on 5 different methods of enriching uranium for a bomb. Ritter was an essential inspector in the hunt for Iraq's nuclear weapons program. The president said the British government had discovered that Saddam Hussein recently sought considerable quantities of uranium from Africa, speaking the 16 words that would live in infamy. Later, under pressure from Congress, CIA Director George Tenet was forced to acknowledge that Hase's 16 words should never have been included in the text written for the president. Even if the claim that British intelligence existed was valid, the CIA did not believe the report, as Tenet later remarked. Tenet stated that the CIA should have ensured that it was removed because the existence of British intelligence, did not rise to the level of certainty which should be required for presidential speeches. The truth is that President Bush's entire argument regarding Iraq was false, and the CIA was engaged in assisting the president in spreading that falsehood. The primary intent of this falsehood was to make Congress and the American people believe that Iraq, particularly its leader, Saddam Hussein, posed a threat severe enough to justify going to war. Bush declared, year after year, Saddam Hussein has gone to great lengths, spent enormous sums of money, and taken great dangers to develop and maintain weapons of mass destruction. Yet why? Bush responded to this query as the only rationale, the sole use he could have for those weapons, was to dominate, threaten, or attack. Bush also claimed that Saddam Hussein might renew his plans to conquer the Middle East and wreak devastating havoc there if he had access to nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. Bush proclaimed the American people and Congress must also be aware of a new threat. Saddam Hussein supported and shielded terrorists, including al-Qaeda members, based on information from intelligence sources, covert conversations, and statements made by those in detention. Bush further claimed that Hussein might assist terrorists in creating their weapons or secretly give them one of his hidden weapons without leaving any traces. Many people worldwide thought Saddam Hussein could have been restrained before September 11. Chemical weapons, deadly diseases, and shady terrorist networks, however, are difficult to contain. Imagine those 19 hijackers, this time equipped by Saddam Hussein, with new tools and schemes. One vial, one canister, or one crate smuggled into this nation would be all needed to usher in an unprecedented day of horror. To ensure that day never comes, Bush said Americans would take action within their ability. The president then moved on to the main topic of his speech, Iraq. Quote, "The United States will request the UN Security Council meeting on February 5, 2003, to discuss the facts surrounding Iraq's persistent defiance of the international community. In addition, information and intelligence about Iraq's illegal weapons programs, efforts to conceal those programs from inspectors, and connections to terrorist organizations will be presented by Secretary of State, Colin Powell." End quote. The president addressed the American people directly as he fixed his gaze on the camera. Then, he added, quote, "We'll confer, but let there be no mistake, we will lead a coalition to disarm Saddam Hussein if he does not fully disarm for the safety of our people and the world's peace." End quote. The president told lies in his address. They are all falsehoods. There was nothing more Ritter could do to stop America from starting a war based on lies.